Top of the morning to you. Welcome to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine today. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Ukrainian Security Services says an alleged informant for Russia detained in connection to a plot to assassinate Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Russian missile strikes the center of Ukraine's Pokrovsk twice, killing 8 people and injuring 10 others. Plus, residents of a village in Russia's far east to be evacuated from their homes as Moscow plans to send up first moon lander since 1976 on Friday. Thank you for joining us. The Ukrainian Security Services, SBU, says an alleged informant for Russia has been detained in connection to a plot to assassinate Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. According to a statement from the SBU, the detained woman has not been named publicly, but officially saying she is a resident of Otakov in the Mykolaiv region and a former saleswoman in a military store. The Ukrainian Security Services said she'd been gathering intelligence about President Zelensky's planned visit to Mykolaiv at the end of July in order to plan a Russian airstrike to kill the president. However, the SBU agents have obtained information about the subversive activities of the suspect and adopted additional security measures following the plot. It said that it caught the woman red-handed as she was trying to pass intelligence to the invaders. In monitoring the communications of the woman, the SBU established that she also had the task of identifying the location of electronic warfare systems and warehouses with ammunition of the armed forces. She allegedly traveled around the territory of the district and filmed the locations of Ukrainian objects. Russian missiles struck the center of Ukraine's Pokrovsk twice overnight, killing 8 people, including 5 civilians, and injuring 10 others. Footage from the town shows firefighters working among streets strewn with rubble, the wreckage of a car, and several damaged apartment buildings. A local resident, 75-year-old Luida, said she was on the phone at the moment of the second blast, which resulted in a curtain and window falling on her and leaving her with cuts. According to Ukrainian officials, 2 rescuers and 1 military person were amongst the dead. 9 policemen and 1 military person were wounded, but most of the 31 injured were civilians, including a member of the local city council. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says the Russian missile strikes on the residential buildings in the eastern Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk caused casualties, adding that rescue operations are underway. He wrote on his Telegram channel, in his words, "All our services are working on the spot. Unfortunately, we have victims. They are wounded and they are dead. My condolences to the families and friends." He adds that there were 2 missile strikes, and as a result of the second missile strike, a member of the State Emergency Services, Colonel Andriy Omolchenko, who is a deputy head of the State Emergency Services in the Donetsk region, was killed in the attack. Officials in Ukraine say a woman was killed yesterday when Russian forces shelled the southern city of Kherson, while 2 other people were killed in Russian shelling of border areas of the Kharkiv region in the northeast. Both the city of Kherson and parts of the Kharkiv region are directly adjacent to the front line. The Ukrainian military has reported increased Russian attacks in the Kharkiv region in recent days. Ukraine recaptured Kherson city and parts of the Kherson region in November after months of Russian occupation. But Russian forces regularly shell the city and surrounding areas from across the Dnipro River. This month, a doctor was killed and 5 medical workers were wounded in Russian shelling of a Kherson hospital. Russia denies deliberately targeting civilians or hospitals during its invasion of Ukraine, which is now in its 18th month and has resulted in the deaths of thousands of people, the uprooting of millions, and the destruction of Ukrainian towns and cities. In the meantime, Russia said its forces have hit more Ukrainian targets and repelled attacks in several directions, while Ukraine said it had launched multiple airstrikes and shelling on Russian positions. According to official briefings from the two countries, the Russian Defense Ministry issued a battle report saying the Russian army continues to concentrate its main forces in the directions of Kupiansk and destroyed Ukrainian military projects, including tanks, armored vehicles, and M77 artillery systems. In addition, the Russian air defense troops intercepted unmanned drones, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and HIMARS multiple rocket launchers from Ukraine. On the other hand, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces issued a report saying that in the past 24 hours, some 30 combat clashes took place in different directions up the front. The Ukrainian army also launched multiple strikes on the positions of Russian personnel and equipment and attacked the areas under Russian control, as well as artillery positions and radar stations of Russia. Ukraine's nuclear chief says the international nuclear watchdog expert of the Russian-held Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant had very limited access to the facilities. The head of Ukraine's state nuclear energy company, Petro Kotin, made his comments on a surprise visit to a Ukrainian nuclear plant undisclosed for security reasons. He adds that the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, expert only had access to the roofs of the nuclear units and that there were areas at the plant they just do not have access to.
And actually, we know, talking about this IAEA, the experts who are right now located at the plant, they have very limited access. You know, they had access to the roof of 2 units, actually. They never have been allowed to go to other nuclear units. You can go there, or you can insist, please allow me access to there and see what is in there. And also, same situation with different zones at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. They just do not have access to that.
Russia will launch its first lunar landing spacecraft in 47 years on Friday, August the 11th, in a race with India to the south pole of the moon, a potential source of water to support a future human presence there. The launch from the Vostochny Cosmodrome, 3,450 miles east of Moscow, will take place 4 weeks after India sent up its Chandrayaan-3 lunar lander due to touch down to the pole on August the 23rd. Rough terrain makes a landing there difficult, but the South Pole is a prized destination because scientists believe it may hold significant quantities of ice that could be used to extract fuel and oxygen, as well as for drinking water. The Russian space agency Roscosmos said its Luna 25 spacecraft will take 5 days to fly to the moon and then spend 5 to 7 days in lunar orbit before descending on one of 3 possible landing sites near the pole, a timetable that implies it could match or narrowly beat its Indian rival in the moon's surface. According to a local official, residents of a village in Russia's far east will be evacuated from their homes at 7:30 a.m. on Friday because of a 1 in a million chance that one of the rocket stages that launched Luna 25 could fall to Earth there. Now let's talk to a security expert, Mr. Onyekachi Adekoya, who joins me virtually from Abuja, the Federal Capital Territory, North Central Nigeria. You're welcome to the program and good morning.
Yeah, good morning and thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure indeed. Mr. Adekoya, am I missing something here? In the midst of this grueling war between Russia and Ukraine, with all this flurry of sanctions and the hoopla over this enterprise, Russia still has the time to send a spacecraft to the moon?
Yeah, I mean, no surprise at all. I think that the spacecraft to the moon fits Moscow's strategy of separating from the International Space Station and maybe launching a collaboration with China in the near future. But I think what you may have missed was that yesterday, Russia reportedly launched an additional military space craft, a satellite into space, bringing its military constellation of satellites to an increased and alarming number, effectively giving it pinpoint accuracy in terms of its ISR capability. So Russia, under Vladimir Putin, has been pursuing a very aggressive modernization of their forces, what you may want to call their nuclear triad forces. So it's not a surprise at all. I mean, it just shows their impressive resolve to do what they need to do to keep their country ahead. Again, remember, we're in this phase of fierce competition between the US, Russia, and China. So nothing new to see. I think the new and surprising player would have been India, which launched something similar, I think, 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Now, what does this say of the Russian state of mind and President Putin and their technological prowess and their resilience in the midst of this war? We recall that Louis Armstrong, the American, was the first man on the moon. The United States beat Russia to it. And then all the other countries began to get on board to see what they could do. Does this mean that the Russian economy is more resilient than at first thought?
Yeah, I mean, to the Louis Armstrong case, some even claim there are some counter claims on who landed first on the moon, but we'll leave that for the conspiracy theorists. To say whether or not Russia is resilient, it's 18 months thereabout into the war, and yes, Russia has been quite impressive in adapting, adjusting, and taking very important lessons from the war. There are weapon systems that Russia did not have 18 months ago that they currently have. And almost every other month, we're seeing new weapon systems coming to the fore. Apparently, they must have been developing this for a long time. You must remember that Russia started to prepare for this war since 2008, after Putin gave that famous speech at the Munich conference. And both sides of this conflict also formally began to prepare more aggressively after the Crimea invasion by Russia. So not too many surprises in terms of how Russia has prepared. Russia has played the waiting game, I think, since early 2001, trying to steadily modernize, deepen its resilience, onshore some of the productive capability. And what we now see is an alarming state of preparedness. In risk management, we talk about preparedness. I don't think that the parties may have underestimated Russia. I think that they may have been some level of information bias. Certain people choosing to see the narrative they want to see or push for the narrative that supports an objective, which is a strategic weakening of Russia. So I think that's what's been at play, because if you also look at the manufacturing sector, local vehicle manufacturing is up in Russia. A lot of things are being onshored. Russia is a net exporter of even base materials, and not just oil and gas. And now they're trying to evolve in the area of technology. So it shows a drilled plan, which the Russians have kept close to their chest and are now implementing. The multilateral engagements they're having with BRICS, also leveraging and piggybacking off of China's financial systems, new collaborations with Iran, with Venezuela, places like North Korea, the outreach towards Africa. So you can see the Russia that used to be is no longer that Russia that was happy to just suck it up and just align itself with global ideals. We are seeing a Russia that is emerging from the conflict, pursuing aggressively its own strategic interests. Case in point would be the joint naval drill between Russia and China off the coast of Alaska, also trying to also pursue other strategic interests beyond the borders of Russia. So there's a whole lot to unpack in the coming days as we see the actors in this geopolitical spat try to gain an advantage over the other, or at least keep pace with their strategic competitors.
And as they try to gain that advantage one over the other, as you just said, how did you take the latest report of the woman, the Ukrainian woman, who attempted to try to spy for the Russians with a view of the assassination of President Zelensky? Allegedly, I say, because depending on which side you listen to, there's a lot of propaganda going on. So that this woman was caught, we don't know how hard it was for her to have been caught. But how did you take that news? The fact that she's a Ukrainian and the fact that she has been apprehended trying to do so dastardly a deed?
Yeah, so I would remind the viewers that the Ukrainians and Russians share a huge Soviet history together. And propaganda is not only the domicile of the Russians, the Ukrainians also know how to do this. If Russia wanted to take out the president of Ukraine, which I think President Putin had made several assurances to Israel and other countries, even to France, that they had no intentions of doing that. Again, the question is, why would Russia want to take out President Zelensky, who in their own estimation is leading the country badly and doing very badly at the front? There is no incentive, I would think, to take him out. You may just have another person with a more deeper resolve, or you have a bigger problem. It's like the question of why didn't they take out Hitler at the time when, you know, the Germans were losing. So Russia is has yet a lot of advantage in this war. It's a war of decision for Russia. They also have that fraternal connection with Ukraine. They are also managing and taking a nuanced approach to their escalation. Despite the pinpricks from Ukraine, you see a rather slow and measured response from Russia going forward. So I don't think that the allegation, Russia doesn't need just one asset to gain the advantage, that information of spying space over Ukraine. Russia has already infiltrated Ukraine, as the SBU has also infiltrated the FSB. They are near neighbors, so they have ways of getting their information. I just think that this is one of those things you put out there in the information space, because the information space is also a domain of warfare. I'm sure there are some objectives to this, but if Russia really wanted to take out the president of Ukraine, then all the time that President Zelensky was flying, it was a very fair target for them. You know, so I know they also have the Kings of Missile. They have not gone after the institution of state, the presidential palace in Ukraine. They've not done any of that yet. They have not sought what we call a decapitation strategy yet as of today. So I'm not sure what this information is aiming at, but it doesn't smell credible to me.
Do you see President Putin's posture in this war as being measured? You just mentioned that targets such as presidential palaces or really important administrative places in Ukraine have not been targeted, but we don't know that for a fact also because of the effectiveness of the air defense systems of Ukraine. But that being said, for those that think that President Putin wants to take over the world, as it were, well, restore the old Soviet Union and absorb all these countries who he thinks have a historical tie to Russia and should be part of Russia, can you help us to understand that filial connection, which you alluded to as well? For instance, before the war, we know that Donbass and Luhansk, where emanated the DPR and the LPR, those were the stages that precipitated the military invasion when it began. And those people are Ukrainian. We're not sure whether Ukrainian Russians. We understand that the Russians are infiltrating Ukraine. How much of it is propaganda and how much of it is true that the Russians went out of their way to infiltrate Ukraine and convince Ukrainians to say they want to be a part of Russia and not a part of Ukraine?
Well, I'm not sure where you're getting this information from, or who's suggesting that. If you recall, in 2014, when you had the Ukrainian Maidan, what you may also call the ousting of a democratically elected government in Ukraine, just at the tip of that event, the then Ukrainian president had reached out to Russia, inviting Russia in a letter dated, inviting Russia to use military means to save the government then in Kiev. And Russia didn't take any of those steps because Russia also has this history with the Soviet Union, and you don't want to occupy a place where you're not wanted. In the parts of Western Ukraine, they have more affinity to Lithuania and Polish. As a matter of fact, the Poles. As a matter of fact, I think there's a bill now being passed in the Ukrainian Duda to form a Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Polish brigade to come into Western Ukraine. A move that Russia claims is a pretext for Poland to preoccupy the areas it feels are historically Polish. We've not seen Russia show that incentive to repeat the errors of the Soviet Union. Russia has a landmass that spans from Asia to Europe to Antarctica, with a population of about 140 million people, remembering that they lost over 26 million people in the Second World War. Russia doesn't have the population to even fully occupy the landmass it has, let alone seeming to want to occupy. No, I don't think Russia is the Soviet Union. They've not postured that way. Since their current president took over, he's gone about a modernizing, reposturing of Russia to bring it into that strategic play with the US and China. I think Russia wants to be Russia from our own assessment for now. Perhaps events on ground may change, as some claim that you can't be pacifist to an expansionist Russia. But their claim is that Russia invaded Georgia, occupied Crimea, and not also looking at the provocations to Russia's strategic interests within where it calls its own sphere of influence. The Americans have what you call the Monroe Doctrine, and some also have also argued if you flip sides and put Russia in the place of America, how would America react? So there are a whole number of moving legs and angles to this, but there's not enough suggestion to say that Russia wants to be the old Soviet Union. Yes, Russia is on an expansionist outreach to Africa, and yes, Africa is warming up a bit to Russia and China, as you can see if you look at the map of Africa, from Central Africa, Sudan to Guinea-Bissau. You can see the effects of some of those outreach, and then you can see Russia's outreach to South Africa within the BRICS. Yes, some of that is happening. I think if the French, the US, the Europeans can do their outreach, nothing stopping Russia or Nigeria, for instance, to do an outreach to Europe. But I understand our foreign policy is more African-centric. So nothing to see. It's just the whole game of geopolitics between world powers.
To respond to part of what you said, so obviously reiterating what analysts and politicians and leaders around the world have said, that Russia does have an expansionist agenda. They have said in multiple public fora that Russia does have a Soviet Union intention. So that's as far as that is concerned. And as far as my information on Donbass and Luhansk, that's pretty much in the public domain. Multiple sources where the Minsk Protocol, you alluded to 2014, that's where the first Minsk Protocol, the Minsk Accord, I beg your pardon, was engaged with Russia, Ukraine, Germany, I believe France came together to try and... Yeah, so my point now is that for those, we've heard many say that these are brothers fighting, and they are so historically linked. Is it that there are so many, there's a significant number of Ukrainians who are pro-Russian, that precipitated this crisis in the first place. Maybe not enough to say they want to secede from Ukraine, but that they are so pro-Russian that it encouraged Putin to take the position that he took.
Yeah, so when you say pro-Russian, Ukraine has always been a multi-ethnic country. The eastern part of Ukraine are Russians, or what you say, yes, Russian-speaking Ukrainian citizens.
Yes.
Okay, even down to Odessa, Crimea. So those parts, and they are Russians. And Putin has argued for a long time that he's watched the massacre, the onslaught of the Ukrainian army against Russians. And he had been calling out, as according to him, reaching out to the West and reaching out to Ukraine to reach some form of armistice and to reach an agreement, which precipitated the Minsk Accord. Now, you heard the then German Chancellor come out to say that the Minsk Accord was just a ploy to delay, to give Ukraine some time to arm up for a full onslaught with Russia. And at the time Russia executed what he calls a special military operation, Russia had at the time felt that Ukraine was becoming dangerously armed. And of course, if you look at the reports, over 110 to 20 or $30 billion has been spent till date preparing and arming Ukraine for what is going on now within the eastern part. So yes, the history is that during the 2014 coup, the eastern part of Ukraine said they would not support the coup, and that, you have to return the legitimately elected government back to power, otherwise they will become an independent set of regions to themselves. Of course, Ukraine resisted that, and that led to a military engagement. It was never going to be a fair fight. Ukraine, before the war, had a force of over 400,000 soldiers. Compare that to the UK's current 66,000 soldiers. So Ukraine was never a pushover in Europe. It had, as a matter of fact, one of the largest fighting forces anywhere in Europe. Well trained, well drilled. So what you see happening in Ukraine is, apart from the fact that Russia is against an alliance of 31 countries, Ukraine is no pushover. So the fight was never fair between Ukraine and the Ukrainian government and the eastern parts of Ukraine. So Putin claims that he has had to move in. Of course, we want to get into the history of formation of Wagner, and then when you had some pro-Russian forces, some moves by the Russian Ministry of Defense to support Luhansk and the next People's Republic with some firepower. So that had been going on. What we see today is a climax of some agitation that had been going on since 2008 that almost reached a tipping point in 2014 when you had the Minsk Accord, and then issues were not managed, and Russia feeling that you must also understand that Russia's warm water seaport, or the access to warm water all year round, is the Black Sea. Yeah. And the east of Ukraine was also Russia's breadbasket, as it were, apart from the fact that they are majorly Russian speaking. A referendum has been conducted even in Crimea. Yes, you can claim that perhaps it was under force, but it's on record that they did vote to join with the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation took steps to onboard the new territories, signed into law by President Putin, acknowledged by their State Duma. So Russia can make some claims, okay? Ukraine can also make some claims. And fighting would not solve the problem. I do think that parties have to come to resolve this through international diplomacy and dialogue. But as we can see now, Russia would argue that it has exhausted its own patience. What it cannot achieve through dialogue, it will now seek to achieve through the objectives of a special military operation. And it doesn't have any incentive now, because this is now the third month of Ukraine's counteroffensive. And reports suggest that Ukraine has lost over 40,000 soldiers. You now have what you call the Bradley graveyards. You have what you call the Leopard 2 graveyards. There's a lot of loss of munitions on the part of Ukraine. Some reports suggest over 30% of the weapons supplied have been destroyed. A caveat though, the bulk of the weapons promised to Ukraine have not yet been delivered. I understand that in this month, the Abrams tanks promised to Ukraine will begin to come in. So Ukraine will still yet pack a punch. And Russia understands this. So they have a lot yet in reserve. I think yesterday President Putin sent out a letter to Rostec to ramp up the production of the Lancet drones. Also, they've now gone on a surge footing for armaments, ammunition for the Russian forces. Recruitments are up. Some are arguing that by next year, Russia may have mobilized and almost 900,000 ready-to-go soldiers. So Russia has said it will fight this battle if it needs to fight this battle for the next 2-3 years. Because for Russia, this is a battle of decision. It's a battle at its own doorstep. And, you know, they have the supply lines, the communication lines to their forward operating bases. They can't go on for a long time. The question is, how long can Europe, the West, go on supplying these weapons into Ukraine? Russia is now attacking, as you see. Yes, go ahead.
That's a very important question, but we'll have to leave it there for purposes of time. Thank you so much for that historical perspective. It helps to understand, when you bring the genesis of this conflict into view, to understand why we are where we are at this stage in the war. However, it's ironic that even though Eastern Ukraine is Russian-speaking for the most part, and Ukrainians have accused Russia of being very, very selfish, that Eastern Ukraine has suffered a lot in this war with all the destruction that has happened there from the shelling and the conflict. But thank you so much for your perspective and your insight and information this morning, Mr. Onyekachi Adekoya, security expert who joined us. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
United States says China's attendance at talks on Ukraine war is productive, even as China commends Saudi talks. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the sophomore stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Biden administration is working on a supplemental funding request for Ukraine that will likely be ready for Congress to consider by this fall. That's according to Army Acquisition Chief Doug Bush. Mr. Bush was quoted as saying the administration is working on a package for Congress to consider this fall, adding that the details still have to be determined by the Office of Management Budget. He adds in his words, but I think we'll have a very strong case and hopefully garner congressional support for continued funding, in particular for munitions production increases and munitions buys to support Ukraine. The United States said it was productive that China attended talks in Saudi Arabia to make headway towards a peaceful settlement of Russia's war in Ukraine. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller told reporters that U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland held a brief separate meeting with China's Special Envoy for Eurasian Affairs and former Ambassador to Russia, Li Hui, at the talks in Jeddah.
Productive that China attended. I'm not going to speak to the details of the meeting because it was a private meeting, but we thought it was productive that they came. We have long said that it would be productive for China to play a role in ending the war in Ukraine if it was willing to play a role that respected Ukraine's territorial integrity and Ukraine's sovereignty. And as I said when I was asked about this a moment ago, we believe it's helpful for countries to attend and hear directly from Ukraine. And I would note that Russia apparently objects to that because you saw Russia criticizing this meeting over the weekend and criticizing the fact that this meeting was held. So we think it's productive for any country to come and hear directly from Ukraine about the concerns Ukraine has. We think it was productive that China did so. In addition to attending the meeting, Deputy Secretary Nuland and the National Security Advisor held a brief separate meeting with the Chinese Special Envoy. So I wouldn't want to say who is in the lead for talks that right now are not happening. There are no peace negotiations going on with Russia right now because Russia has refused to engage in meaningful peace negotiations. Should there ever be peace negotiations, it's Ukraine that will be in the lead from the non-Russian side. The United States is happy to play any role that is productive to stand with our Ukrainian partners, and we would welcome any other country that wants to play a productive role as well.
Meanwhile, Beijing has commended the talks aimed at finding a formula for peace in Ukraine after a Chinese envoy attended the weekend summit in Saudi Arabia that was slammed by Russia as doomed to fail. China said the two-day meeting in Jeddah helped to consolidate international consensus on finding a peaceful solution to the conflict. The talks brought together more than 40 nations, including Ukraine, the United States, European states, and the BRICS group of countries, perhaps none as closely watched as China, Russia's most powerful ally. While the summit yielded little more than a pledge to hold more discussions in the future, Ukraine hailed China's attendance as a diplomatic victory. Beijing had steered clear of previous round of talks in Denmark in June, but has deepened its ties with Saudi Arabia in recent years. Now let's talk to Mr. Osareme Ezebukun, research consultant, Padlink, joining me virtually from Germany. You're welcome to the program. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. It was never going to be a fait accompli, this meeting in Saudi Arabia with all these 40 nations, when you exclude Russia, who have gone as far as saying that it was impossible for any sort of agreement to come or for any sort of progress to be made as a result of this meeting, saying that the meeting, because it considered only Ukraine's proposal, undermined all the other proposals of all the other nations who've tried to intercede in this matter, and that it will just not, it'll be dead on arrival and nothing will come of it. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I'd like to say explicitly that what we have here is a multi-dimensional interest pattern. Now, what this simply means is that we have all the various actors with their various intents, and they have their own idea about what a peaceful negotiation should entail. And so we have a situation where Russia says, this is the pattern that we want you to address, a pattern that has not been okay, with our national interest. And then the United States comes in and says, no, we have to go with the pattern that is being presented by our partner nation, in this conflict, which is Ukraine. Now, you should understand that from the very onset, we had the situation where it was Russia that invaded Ukraine first, but then they had some positions for why they had to do or why they had to take such actions. Okay, now we're coming to possibly like a year and a few months after, and you say, yes, we're trying to negotiate for peace. And then these interests that Russia has presented or that made Russia, invade Ukraine is not being considered. And then we're also looking at Ukraine saying, look here, this is our country. You see, we're a sovereign nation. You can't just move into our country and with your own interests or whatever you have, your historic or legendary cravings to be an empire. You want to overcome or to subdue us. So these are some of the points that we need to address. So I believe that they all need to come to the table, to try to stop the tide of bloodletting in that country. The tide of bloodletting, understanding that the eastern part of Ukraine have wholly and solely with all intents requested that they be addressed as Russians. But this is not the way things should happen. Now, Russia should also put in perspective that, for example, Now, for example, if a region of Russia today decides that they want to go, would Putin allow such a thing to happen? No, these are some of the things that we should begin to bring to the table and begin to ask the Russians directly. And also, let's also begin to ask the United States to play the neutral, the neutral arbiter, the neutral, how do you put it now, peacemaker, in this situation. I'd like to stop there for now.
When you speak of bloodletting, it certainly is the case where over 10,000 civilians have been killed by the admission of the Ukrainians themselves on the Ukrainian side. But if you really want peace and you really want mediation and you really want a resolution and it's a peace talk, why would you not invite the two sides to the table? Ukraine has been accused and Russia has been accused of being intransigent, of being obdurate, of being stubborn, and that they will not want to concede an inch. But when it comes to conflict resolution, you have to concede some sort of something to bring about that said resolution. Do you think that Ukraine came to this party in good faith?
Well, I wouldn't ask you to call it a conflict resolution now. Let's not look at it in that way. Let's see it as individuals or individual countries coming and wanting their own interests, addressed. Okay, you cannot say that, for example, Russia has a prehistoric or a prehistoric interest. Allow me to use that. You cannot say they have this interest and then, the interest become an empire and then they invade Ukraine because there are some Russian-speaking people on the territory of Ukraine, a sovereign state. Now, there is also another part where they've asked, okay, NATO is getting too close to us. Please, we need you to address these perspectives. We need you to move back a bit. We are not in a war where we don't have a war situation. There was no warmongering at the time. Okay, please just move back a little. We're a peaceful country. But you see that somehow they began to get, they got spies everywhere, and they began to get information that, they were actually trying to take Ukraine. Now, Ukraine in the middle of two superpowers should have known better to play their games well. You don't take from this side and take from this side and expect that, things will be okay. So I believe that, answering your question, I believe that Ukraine is only trying to ensure that the territories before this war that were called Ukraine now comes back to Ukraine. This is what I believe that it is. They want the pre-war territory of Ukraine to remain Ukraine. They want it all back. But I don't know how that goes to reason.
Yes. It's certainly something that deserves a lot of prayer and a lot of thought and a lot of mediation and a lot of goodwill amongst the nations and influence as well. Over 531 days into this conflict and still no end in sight. But thank you so much for your contribution this morning. It's well appreciated. Mr. Osarimen Ezebuko, a research consultant, Padlink, who joined us from Germany.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
When we return, 22 soldiers return home in latest prisoner swap with Ukraine and Russia. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the final stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine to pecuniary issues. The Russian ruble slid to a more than 16-month low, past 96 to the dollar, early on Monday, hurt by strong local demand, by former currency and typically lower support from exporters at the start of the month. The ruble was extending losses after dropping more than 4% against the dollar and euro to record one of its worst weeks all year. Russian authorities say lower export revenue and rebounding imports are the primary cause of the ruble weakening. The ruble tends to weaken early each month after losing the support of a month-end tax period that usually sees exporting firms convert foreign exchange revenues to meet local liabilities. Market players have also attributed the ruble's jitters to Western companies' exit from Russia, which can require large forex purchases and foster currency market volatility. And for the business dimension to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ini John Mekwa, Channels Television business correspondent, joins us. Ini, good morning.
Good morning.
They say money makes the world go round.
It is.
Is it going to go around?
All things.
As all things?
Yeah.
Well, which things?
If it's a thing, money will answer to it. If it's a thing.
Money answers all. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Now I understand.
Okay.
But is it going to answer that much in Russia now because the ruble is suffering a dip?
Mm-hmm. It suffers a dip. It suffers a dip, like as you read, almost every month, I think, because obviously it's not getting the support that it normally would get. The high demand by Western companies to pay taxes, because of course, if you're operating in Russia, then you have to pay your taxes with the ruble. Yeah. So it lost that since the war started and the reaction to it, and all the Western companies that have fled Russia. So, I guess they've gotten used to it by now. The war is over a year, so they know that whether they don't get as much as they used to get. So It loses that value when it is supposed to get that support, and it doesn't get it. What
are the lessons for Africa, Ukraine to transit Russian gas through the country?
So,
Russian gas or Ukrainian gas?
It's Russian gas.
How come?
Exactly my point. So Russian gas, there are two entry points or exit points through which Russian gas goes through Ukraine, to the exporters, to the customers, Russian customers. And it's very important, I think, and that's why I really to bring this story home. Yeah. Because at this rate, when we're talking about, there's war and Russia and Ukraine, they don't see eye to eye, they are still doing business. Russian gas is still, yes, incredible. Russian gas is still going through Ukraine. And of course, that will not be for free. Ukraine will be making money from that, of course, as well as Russia. And these are two countries at war. When we bring this home, it just reminds me of, I don't know if you saw that track with Mr. Tedo Peterside, because of what's going on in Niger. Nigeria has closed its air, Niger has closed its air. And Mr. Peterside yesterday explained some of the implication that this will bring, especially towards Nigerians.
Mr. Tedo Peterside.
Yes, Tedo Peterside. We are the ones who go to Europe and all of that, and we have to pass through Nigerian air. We were the ones as Nigeria who first closed the air, and now they have responded. So when we want to travel now, where do we go to? We have to go round the circle before we can get out.
By the way, closing that airspace, the European carriers have already confirmed that it has increased the number of hours that planes have to travel.
Yes, exactly.
And lots of detours have to be made because of the closure of the Nigerian airspace.
Now, Mr. Peterside said something yesterday. If you are going to sanction a country, don't sanction yourself instead of sanctioning the country. What mostly has happened now, we are the great travelers. Nigerians are always traveling. How many Nigerians come backwards through Nigeria to travel? How many of them even travel?
Nigeria was the first, victims, as it were.
But we were the first to bring up that restriction. We were the first too. You understand? Now, look at Russia and Ukraine and even the West. They are still trading in oil, only not through the water. in spite of the war and the sanctions. Africans need to learn from this. We need to be diplomatic in our approach, especially with ourselves. That there's a coup in Niger. Of course, nobody's supporting that. And sanctions are necessary, but let them be well thought out and not the ones that will put us in bigger problem. I mean, more stress for Nigerians.
One has to have a disposition to learn to do so in the first place.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ini.
Thank you for having me.
Ini John Mekwa. Finally, on the program, Russia and Ukraine carried out the latest in a series of prisoner exchanges with 22 Ukrainian soldiers returning home. Now, Andriy Yermak, the head of the President Volodymyr Zelensky's office, posted a video on Telegram showing soldiers wrapped in blue and yellow Ukrainian flags posing for pictures and shouting, "Glory to Ukraine." Ukraine Coordinating Headquarters for the Treatment of Prisoners of War posted footage of a wounded soldier thanking them for his release. News agencies were not able to confirm the location or the date or the videos or the photos. And that's where we leave it for today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Many thanks to you for watching. Also to our guests and our producers. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Have a good day, and please join us again tomorrow.